In this chapter, we'll be looking at the central nervous system. We'll be discussing main topics such as the spinal cord and the brain. Meninges. The meninges are protective connective tissue layers that surround the brain and spinal cord. There are three layers. The dura mater is the outermost layer. It is thick and tough. The arachnoid mater contains fibers that look like a spider's web, and hence the name arachnoid. The spider web-like structure forms the subarachnoid space, a small space found between the arachnoid and pia mater. This space is filled with cerebral spinal fluid and acts like a cushion around the brain and spinal cord. The innermost layer is the pia mater. This is a very thin membrane that is directly in contact with the brain and spinal cord. Cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF, is a clear, colorless liquid. It surrounds and bathes the external surfaces of the brain and spinal cord. It fills the subarachnoid space, the ventricles, which are internal chambers of the brain, and the canals of the central nervous system. CSF is formed mainly by ependymal cells in the central nervous system. Recall ependymal cells were a supportive neuroglial cell in the nervous system. The cerebral spinal fluid functions in 1. Buoyancy. This keeps the brain afloat. 2. Protection. It prevents the brain from colliding into the cranium. 3. Chemical stability, in that it is a transportation system for removal of waste via the choroid plexus. The choroid plexus are a network of capillaries that are found in each of the ventricles. We'll be talking about these later on. The brain barrier system, otherwise abbreviated BBS. The brain is very sensitive to agents within the blood, more so than other tissues. The brain barrier system prevents harmful components in blood to come into contact with the brain tissue. The brain barrier system protects the brain tissue from two potential exposures: 1. The blood vessels throughout the brain tissue, and 2. The choroid plexus located in the ventricles. The blood vessels throughout the brain tissue are covered by astrocytes and forms the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier creates tight junctions that prevents unnecessary things to pass from the blood vessels into the surrounding brain tissue. The choroid plexus are a network of capillaries found in the ventricles. They allow for exchange between the CSF and the blood. The ependymal cells form a similar tight junction around the choroid plexus. This is referred to as the blood-CSF barrier. The brain barrier systems are permeable to certain substances and allows the following to easily move through the membrane, such as water, glucose for nutrition, gases, CO2 and O2. Unfortunately, alcohol and caffeine are certain drugs, amongst others, that can also easily pass through the brain barrier systems. We're going to move on and talk about the spinal cord. The spinal cord has a number of functions, such as 1. Conduction. The spinal cord can carry impulses to and from the brain. 2. Integration. The spinal cord is capable of integrating or processing information from the peripheral nervous system and sending it out to the appropriate responses. 3. Locomotion. This refers to the spinal cord's control over complex motor skills that involve repetitive muscle contractions. For example, when walking, the brain may initiate the action, but then the spinal cord takes over the continuation of that action. 4. Reflexes. The spinal cord plays an important role in coordination, posture, and quick protective responses to pain or injury. The spinal cord is divided into 4 regions: cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral. Within the spinal cord, there are 2 enlargements. The cervical enlargement, C5 through C7, contains the start of the nerve branches that go to the upper limbs. The lumbar enlargements, L1 through L2, is the start of the nerve branches that go to the lower limbs. It also has an area called the cauda equina. The cauda equina appears like a horse's tail, hence its name. This is a bundle of nerves at the inferior portion of the spinal cord that runs throughout the lumbar and sacral vertebrae. It innervates the pelvic organs and the lower limbs. The spinal cord gives rise to 31 pairs of spinal nerves. In this diagram, you can see the image of the spinal cord. You can see that it's divided into its 4 main regions: the cervical, the thoracic, the lumbar, and the sacrum. You can also see the 2 enlargements, the cervical and the lumbar, as well as at the inferior portion of the spinal cord. You can see how it branches out like a horse's tail, hence the cauda equine. Go through the anatomy of a spinal cord. In the diagram above, you can see a cross-section of the spinal cord. The spinal cord is divided into 2 main tissue types. You have the gray matter, which forms the H or butterfly shape in the spinal cord. It contains somas, dendrites, and parts of the axon. It is the site of neural integration, as the synapses between neurons occur here. If you look at the gray matter, you will find that it's divided into the dorsal or posterior horns. These connect to the dorsal root and ganglion. It also contains the ventral or anterior horns, which connect to the ventral roots. And then in the center of the gray matter, you will find the central canal. The other tissue type that makes up the spinal cord is the white matter. The white matter surrounds the gray matter. They form columns that contain spinal tracts. It is divided into 3 main parts. You can see the dorsal or posterior columns, the ventral or the anterior columns, and then the lateral columns. Make sure you can identify them in the diagram above. The gray matter functions in neural integration, the processing of information, where the white matter functions in conducting the information between the spinal cord and the brain. In this diagram, the ascending columns of the white matter are highlighted in red. This is where information is carried up towards the brain. And the descending tracts are highlighted in green, and these are tracts that carry the information from the brain to the spinal cord. 1 pairs of spinal nerves that extend from the spinal cord. Each nerve is a cord composed of numerous axons bound together by connective tissue. The nerve allows the spinal cord to communicate with the rest of the body. There are 3 types of nerves. 1. Sensory nerves. Sensory nerves contain only afferent fibers. In other words, they carry sensory signals only. These are rare. Examples of sensory nerves include ones for smell and vision. 2. Motor nerves. Motor nerves contain only efferent fibers. In other words, they carry only motor signals. Both these sensory nerves as well as motor nerves conduct signals in one direction only. Sensory nerves conduct information towards the brain, and motor nerves conduct signals away from the brain. A 3rd type of nerve is a mixed nerve. Mixed nerves are the most abundant, and they carry a mix of afferent and efferent fibers, and therefore conduct signals in 2 directions. Certain nerves also have ganglions. Ganglions are clusters of neurosomas, in other words, cell bodies of neurons, that are located outside of the central nervous system. Which type of the 3 nerves that we've talked about would have ganglions? You should have answered sensory and mixed nerves. Since sensory is carrying information towards the brain, they would have cell bodies outside of the central nervous system. And mixed nerves contain both sensory and motor, therefore, because they contain the sensory, they would also have ganglions. Recall a function of the spinal cord is reflexes. A spinal reflex is an involuntary response to a stimulus. It is rather simple and involves very few neurons. They are also very, very quick. There are 3 neurons that make up a spinal reflex path. The sensory neuron has dendrites that are located in the muscle and responds to stretching. The dendrites run all the way from the muscle to the spinal cord, and their somas are located outside of the spinal cord, as mentioned in the previous slide. The axons enter the spinal cord and form a synapse with the integration neuron. The integration neuron processes the information and sends out a response through the motor neuron. The motor neuron axons go all the way to the muscle, but their dendrites are in the spinal cord and synapse with integration neurons. This diagram demonstrates how our reflexes work. When we step on something sharp, the sensory neurons detect the injury and send the message to the spinal cord. The interneurons process and send a message or a response through the motor neuron. They also send a message to the other leg to be prepared to adjust for a change in balance. Then the motor neuron then sends that response to the muscle and results in a quick protective reflex against pain and injury. In the remaining slides, I will be discussing the brain. There are 100 billion nerve cells in the brain. It is a very complex structure. The brain is protected and surrounded by the meninges. These are continuous with the meninges that surround the spinal cord. There are 4 primary regions of the brain, which include the brainstem, the diencephalon, the cerebellum, and the cerebrum. We will be discussing these 4 regions in greater detail in the next slides. The brain has 4 ventricles, which are internal chambers filled with CSF. As I go through their names and locations, please see if you can identify them in the image. There are 2 ventricles in each cerebral hemispheres called the lateral ventricles. There is a ventricle that's located below the corpus callosum called the third ventricle. The last ventricle is located between the pons and the medulla oblongata. This is called the fourth ventricle. The cerebrospinal fluid flows through these ventricles and canals to bathe the brain and spinal cord. Each ventricle also contains a network of capillaries called the choroid plexus that allows for the exchange of substances between the cerebrospinal fluid and blood. Recall that we talked about this on the slide about the brain barrier system. And with the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the largest and most complex portion of the brain. The brain has landmarks that are significant in studying its function. The landmarks include 1. The gyri. These are the ridges or folds of the cerebrum. 2. The sulci. These are the valleys or the shallower grooves. An example of a sulci is the lateral sulcus, which you will be learning in lab. 3. Fissures. Fissures are very deep grooves in the cerebrum, such as the longitudinal fissure. The longitudinal fissure is a fissure that separates the right and left hemispheres of the cerebrum. You will also be learning this in lab. The cerebrum is divided into hemispheres. The right hemisphere is responsible for imagination, artistic traits, and communication, while the left is focused on problem solving, analytical and spatial reasoning, and language. The hemispheres do not operate independently. They are connected by a large bundle of myelinated axons called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum allows the hemispheres to integrate. It is also larger in females than males and allows more access to emotions. The cerebrum is divided into the gray matter and the white matter. The cerebral cortex is the gray matter that covers the entire cerebrum. It is 2 to 3 millimeters thick, but constitutes about 40% of brain mass, so it is very dense. It functions in neural integration. The white matter is the majority of the cerebrum. It is a very complex web of interconnected neurons. It allows communication between the 2 hemispheres, carries information from the cerebrum to other parts of the brain, and links different portions of the same hemisphere. Added into lobes. The frontal lobe mainly controls voluntary motor functions. It is also associated with motivation, foresight, planning, memory, mood, emotion, social judgment, and aggression. The parietal lobe is mainly responsible for receiving and interpreting signals of general senses, or somatic. The occipital lobe is the principal visual center. The temporal lobe processes hearing and smell. It is also associated with learning, visual recognition, and emotional behavior. The insula is less understood as it is a small mass of cortex that is deep to the lateral sulcus, so it's hard to test on living subject. Apparently, it is important for understanding spoken language, interpreting taste, and integration of visual receptors. Using your notes and the textbook, see if you can label the lobes on this diagram of the cerebrum. Moving on to the next region of the brain, which is the diencephalon. The diencephalon is the middle portion of the brain that consists of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The thalamus is a relay station from the spinal cord, brainstem, cerebellum, and parts of the cerebrum to the appropriate cerebral cortex. You can think of the thalamus as a switchboard operator. You call the switchboard operator to be directed to a specific person. That's what the thalamus does in the brain. It directs signals to the appropriate cerebral cortex. Link that to the lobes that we learned about in the previous slide. The hypothalamus is the structure below the thalamus, hence the term hypo meaning below, thalamus. The hypothalamus controls the autonomic nervous system and the endocrine system to have overall ability to maintain homeostasis. The hypothalamus specifically functions in controlling body temperature. It's able to determine hunger, fullness, and thirst, and thereby control food and water intake. The hypothalamus is also responsible for regulating sleep as well as circadian rhythms. It also controls memory and emotional behaviors. Brain is the brainstem. The brainstem makes connections between the brain and the spinal cord. It is the most primal part of the brain. There are 3 areas of the brainstem, which include the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. All 3 serve as an area for motor and sensory tracts to be able to travel up and down for communication between the brain and the spinal cord. The pons particularly has a function in the pneumotaxic center. This refers to the pons respiratory center, which regulates the change from inhalation to exhalation, which continues the breathing cycle. Where the medulla oblongata particularly contains the cardiovascular and medullary rhythmicity center. The cardiovascular center includes its ability to adjust the rate and force of the heartbeat, as well as adjust the blood vessel's diameter to regulate blood pressure. The medullary rhythmicity center refers to its ability to control the rate and depth of breathing, which is different from the pons, where the pons controls the change between inhalation and exhalation for breathing in general. The final region of the brain is the cerebellum. The cerebellum is vital in the coordination of skeletal movement and maintains equilibrium and balance. It is also associated with its ability to act as a timekeeper, and it is involved in language output, impulse control, and can also impact emotional reactions. The cerebellum is highly susceptible to alcohol, and hence when someone is under the influence of alcohol, they lose their ability to coordinate skeletal muscle movement as well as maintain equilibrium and balance. Using your notes and the textbook, label the main parts of the brain. We'll be going over the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is responsible for involuntary actions of the body, especially those that involve the smooth muscle of the respiratory, cardiac, and digestive systems. It plays a big role in homeostasis. There are 2 divisions of the autonomic nervous system, which include the parasympathetic autonomic nervous system and the sympathetic autonomic nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system has a calming effect on the body, like slowing down heart rate and respiration while increasing digestive functions. We often refer to this as the rest and digest system. The sympathetic nervous system adapts the body for physical activity, like increasing heart rate and respiration while decreasing digestion. The system is responsible for our flight or fight response. Both divisions have the ability to excite or inhibit depending on the tissues. we need both divisions to maintain homeostasis. Most of the visceral organs receive signals from both divisions. This is called dual innervation. The systems can have either antagonistic or cooperative effects. Antagonistic effects oppose each other. For example, the sympathetic speeds up the heart and parasympathetic slows it down. They stimulate different cells within an organ, so there are different responses. Another example is blood pressure control. The sympathetic keeps the blood vessels partially constricted to keep blood pressure up. If blood pressure gets too high, the parasympathetic then slows the heart so it is not putting out as much blood and lowers the blood pressure. Cooperative effects act on different cells but have the same overall effect. For example, the parasympathetic stimulates the salivary glands to release a watery substance, while the sympathetic nervous system stimulates the mucus cells of the same gland. The end result is saliva.